All right. Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I am Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And yes, it's I don't know what report we're waking up to each morning, Lisa, but there's always something. Like we predicted 2025 would have no shortage of topics to
Yep.
discuss. So
Yep.
here we are again. How are you, Lisa? What's going on?
Doing good. Weather's in the 60s. Loving it. Loving it. Um, but
Mm-hmm.
the weather is great, but not enough to uh minimize the damage that the chaos is causing. So,
Oh yes. Oh
yeah.
yes. Absolutely. Yeah. I've kind of made it an unofficial rule, Lisa, that I don't look at news really ever until I go out to see it, but I definitely don't look at news like before 10. I
Oh
don't wake up
goodness.
to it like where I pull it up on my phone while I'm still laying in the bed trying to get myself together. I just I just can't. I just cannot do it. So I guess we're everyone's news at least weekly when it comes to this kind of stuff, Lisa. But anyway. Oh, so tell us about the word of the week, Lisa. I was not aware of this word until you brought it to my attention. So please school me, school me.
Okay, so it's a German word, Brandmauer. Apologies if there are any German speakers listening and I messed up that pronunciation. But the reason why I wanted to bring this word of the week is because of what it represents, I think. So, for those who may be unfamiliar, in February, Germany had their elections and they're a parliamentary system. And there are a number of parties in that system, but one of those parties is called Alternatives for Deutschland, Alternatives for Germany, AFD. And it is a far right party. Now, ever since World War II, I don't know exactly the date that this originated, but the political parties in Germany have this word Brandmauer that means firewall. And so they have this universal agreement that they will not engage with or give credence to far right political parties, right? They're basically icing them out. So even if the in this case alternatives for Deutschland wins a significant portion of the vote, none of the other parties that are more mainstream are going to partner with them or support them or engage with them in any way, which has created frustrations for folks who are voting for this AFD party in particular because it makes them feel like their vote doesn't count. But the whole point of this firewall, this Brandmauer, is to prevent right wing, extreme right wing political parties taking any hold in Germany, right? Which makes sense given their history. So it was in the news a lot in February because JD Vance went to the Munich Security Council and he basically chastised Germany among many European countries for their restrictions on free speech, for creating this firewall that prevented Germans in this case who had far right views from being heard and listened to kind of in the public space. Um, and so what I think is interesting is to see this evolve in Germany. And at this point, it is unclear how this Brandmauer firewall is going to hold, because in the elections, the group with the second highest votes was this AFD party, 20% of the votes, highest it's ever gotten. So it has a significant number of representatives in its parliament. So I'm unclear how it's going to move forward. But when I look at that and then I look at the United States and the ways in which far right political and ideological positions have gained so much traction and there is next to no resistance, or what resistance was there
Right.
is now evaporated.
Right.
The kind of the difference in response. And you and I have talked about McCarthyism and how kind of some of this behavior from the federal government feels very McCarthyist, but that's not to the same level as the Holocaust and Germany's violence and genocide of Jewish people, right? So it's a different historical context that has led Germany to create this firewall, but I think that is leading the United States to overlook that extreme right wing ideology and political parties could take hold here. Just because they haven't in the way that they did in Germany in World War II, right, doesn't mean that they won't. And so I thought it was kind of interesting to comparatively think about the two and the ways in which our history is perhaps shaping our belief that things could get that bad here. And so there is no firewall. There's none.
Well, Lisa, this harkens back a little bit to, some of our conversation that we had about, some of the toxic positivity and some of that toxic hope type feel where, oh, it could never happen here. That could never happen here. Or, it would be a far cry. It would be a stretch for that to happen here. And of course, that's part of the strategy, is to make people feel like whatever's going on elsewhere can't happen here. And so then you find yourself on a slippery slope that you don't want to acknowledge. And so for this, I think this gets really interesting because, again, what does that slippery slope look like? Just because it's not in the same exact context doesn't
Right.
mean that it still can't hold. And so for
Right.
me, that's been kind of the frustration, I think, around a lot of people who have been treated like the little chick that says the sky is falling, the sky is falling. Well, what if the sky is slowly falling and they're the
Right.
only one to notice that slow fall, and then everyone the little chicks like us that are running around to say the sky is slowly falling get frustrated because we tried to tell you. And so, I think the apropos warnings get very interesting when they're not believed, and we realize that's part of the strategy, is for it to not be believed, to move so slowly that it seems as if change is not happening when it is. That would go
Yeah.
with McCarthyism, that would go with fascism, that, a number of different things we talked about on
Yeah.
this pod. So
Yeah.
anyway, here we are. But,
Yeah.
oh, well, thank you for giving me a new word, because I think this is one to really continue to pay attention to. Again, if it should slowly creep in new, interesting, and differently labeled ways here. I'll just leave it there. All right. Well, let's get into phase one. Phase one is a pretty interesting one to me because I can go as far back as when I worked at University of Maryland for 10 years. And my immediate director, wonderful person, he directed a program called the College Success Scholars Program, if I can get it out, College Success Scholars Program. And it was for Black and brown males and males of first generation college programs. And it was the only one of its kind at the university. And to bunk stereotypes here, interestingly enough, there's a big gap between the students of color, men of color, who received some of the top full ride scholarships academically, those students that received some of the top full ride or even partial ride scholarships as an athlete, and the wide chasm in between of students that weren't served. And so this program was to serve those young men of color in undergrad that didn't fit into those other categories, but they still needed the academic structure and support. So CSS was fantastic. And as a woman administrator that obviously could do this type of work with most groups, I always knew my lane, my role, my responsibilities with that group. I mean, literally, I could probably run that program right now with nothing but a laptop, students, and time. Okay, I could run that program. And at the same time, when they had their what they called residencies, where they had time together that were in workshops. The first week, that was an entire week-long orientation where parents were dropping their students off at the university to get used to the campus community and go into their workshops and so forth. There was rarely a time, unless I was invited to facilitate a session on a particular topic, there was rarely a time that I went into those places and spaces and study halls and so forth, because they were all Black and brown male spaces. And if you're not paying attention, you won't notice how your presence then changes the climate of the experience. And so I knew that going into it. I knew it for a number of different reasons. I know it even more so now because I have two boys that probably would really thrive in a program such as that. When mom walks in the door, when a woman walks in the door, when a baby sister walks in the door, it doesn't matter. Anyone who is not a male of color in those places and spaces would then change the climate. Now, that doesn't mean that they weren't necessarily welcome there or that anything negative was happening there, but it was a holding space for safer conversations, safer experiences, safer aha moments in ways that could be unfiltered or as unfiltered as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Now, hopefully, folks that are listening to me right now realize that I said I was aware of how the climate changed. And so, therefore, I made sure I stayed out of those climates so that they could have a pure climate to themselves to do their thing.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen this also happen, for example, when I take my sons to the barbershop. Not saying that women can't be there. There's no sign on the door that says no women allowed. That's not what it says. But historically and even recently, barbershops, especially Black-owned barbershops, have been safe havens, safe spaces, places for Black men to talk and experience life together in ways that don't necessarily need the presence of a woman. And so there'll be times when I take my boys to the barbershop where I might drop them off and go do a little shopping for 30 minutes and come back. And when they're ready, pay the barber and walk out. But I
Mm-hmm.
don't intrude on the space and I'm not treated differently. When I'm dropping the boys off, the barber's, hey, Dr. Gold, how you doing? Good, good. Okay, I'll see y'all in a few minutes. It's very cordial, but there is
Mm-hmm.
a cordial boundary that I just don't step over. And so with that, Lisa, I was just thinking about we've talked on this podcast quite a bit about self-awareness or lack
Yeah.
thereof.
Yep. Yep.
And so just being aware of how certain spaces belong to certain groups and what it means when you change the climate based on your presence. And this is not saying that you're doing anything wrong. That's not saying that you are wrong. It's
Right.
just simply
Right.
saying, are you aware of how you change a climate when you walk in the door and if it's necessary?
Yeah.
And so, Lisa, I'm just throwing that out to you just to think about that changing of the climate and just the self-awareness to know that, hey, yes, I can be everywhere, but should I be everywhere? Not necessarily. I don't think that heightened level of self-awareness is I just don't think it's a thing. I don't think it's a thing for so many people that just don't get that. But maybe I'm just coming at it from a different direction. But Lisa, have you had any of those experiences maybe where you
Mm-hmm.
stepped into a space and you're like, yeah, I can be here, but should I? Questionable.
Yeah, I do. I think my evolution around that is mediated by my womanhood and whiteness, right? So I've definitely been in spaces that have been heavily male and haven't felt comfortable from a safety perspective, right? But I've also probably barged into spaces as a white person and had no awareness about that is I'm intruding, right? But one example I can think of is in my graduate program here in the United States when I was doing a whole lot of learning about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and definitely coming from the position that we should treat everyone equally, don't be an asshole, right? Which was kind of like the beginning seed of how I got much more critical around that as time has gone on. But
Good
that
job.
was
That was the kindergarten version of it. Yeah, you got to start
yeah,
somewhere, right? Like start
yeah,
right
got to
there.
start somewhere. So anyway, so one of the classes we took was about inclusion, inclusive university, I think it was called. And we had to do a project called Experiencing Difference. And so the requirements of the project was you had to go somewhere and experience difference. So you had to put yourself in those spaces that you were not used to being in, right? To create an awareness of difference. So I chose to go to a local Black church. And it was challenging for me, one, because I'm white, and two, because I'm not religious and I don't go to church, right? So it was kind of a double whammy discomfort. But I remember being profoundly aware, even then in my kind of early stage development in these areas, I just remember feeling like I shouldn't be there. It felt exploitative, and I've since reflected a lot on it, and I don't even know that they do this activity anymore in that class, but it felt like I was going into that space where, sure, I was welcomed, but it wasn't really my space. And I was learning, I was having an education on the backs of people who, have been oppressed for generations by white people. So it never felt great from that exploitation standpoint. It also felt really uncomfortable. So the the project worked for me, right? Like, it really taught me what it feels like to be in spaces where you are the only, or, so in that sense. But I've always thought about it, and so it felt exploitative, I guess, but I don't know that I thought about how my presence might have changed other people's behavior in the room, right? Like, did the folks in the room feel
Yes.
less comfortable because I was intruding on their space? Right? Because
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
they didn't know I was there, right? I just showed up at church
Yeah.
one Sunday morning.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, again, we realize how historically that could be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Lisa, if we were talking about this before 2015 and before Dylan Ruth's
Mm-hmm.
uh, complete and ridiculous, how can I say, what's the best word for it? Terrorizing of
Mm-hmm.
Black church members, then obviously we might be talking about this a little bit differently. But in the grand scheme of things, you've got such a great point around, it's one thing if you're starting from a place where you don't have any history of individuals kind of taking your spaces
Mm-hmm.
versus inviting people into your spaces being a different matter, right? So,
Right.
like,
Right.
if we're talking about, you know, the long history of segregation in this country, it's like, damn it, can we have any place to ourselves? Really? Verse and that's not a individual, we don't care for the white woman that walked in our church perspective. It's just systemically,
Yeah.
uh, we want a place that's ours.
Yes. Yes.
Systemically,
Yes.
we have rarely, if ever, had them. So that's not a, ooh, we don't like Lisa, the white woman that walked into our worship. It's, ooh, we don't like the systems that created the questioning of a Lisa that's genuinely coming to learn and grow. So those systems are frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
But when you really have to grapple with a ongoing history of takeover and not having clear lines, or if there are clear lines, there are clear lines to keep you out of places rather than
Mm-hmm.
invite you in them. Like, there's just way too much history behind knowing place and space. And so, I just look at people sometimes thinking, you're gonna laugh at this, Lisa. It's funny, but it's not funny. But I thought about this during the pandemic, right? And once we started emerging from the pandemic and we started to have, let's say you go to a store, what have you, and you're in line waiting to pay for your items or whatever it is, and you have those little stickers on the floor that, try to give social distancing and so forth. And I'm thinking to myself, there's been way too many times where I'm like standing there minding my own business, and then there's a white person that's like inches away from me. I'm like, space, do you not see me sitting here, standing here? And so some of this is almost like a social experiment of who maneuvers around place and space and who doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So like I've even reminded the boys on multiple occasions, pay attention to your body, pay attention to how you position your body. Are you standing over someone? Are you standing too close to someone? If you're approaching someone, especially if they're white and you don't know them and they don't know you, be careful as to how you approach them. Do not walk quickly upon some things like that, where I'm constantly thinking about place and space, and I witness people of color have to maneuver these places and spaces without explicitly naming it. And so I guess this particular slice of the episode is really reminding people to pay attention to
Yeah.
places and spaces and how the context changes, and also try to pay attention to people who are navigating spaces in ways and with weight that you have the privilege of not thinking about.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
so Lisa, I don't know this if this is something you thought about, but it's something I've thought about every time I've moved or bought a home or what have you. I remember moving here to Maryland and, kind of house shopping before even laying eyes on the house, the property, the yard, whatever it may be. The first things we started noticing were who's walking around the neighborhood. If a white woman is walking around with her stroller and her kid in the stroller, it must be a relatively safe place. Or no, I don't see too many people out here. I don't see anybody standing at the bus stop. I don't see any of that. So I need to think about how people are navigating space. Those
Yeah.
are things that people of color think about all the time that I guarantee you white folks may not think about as often. And
Mm-hmm.
so thinking about space and what makes people comfortable and what doesn't and so forth, I think it's just really important for us to highlight how some of us have to think about it more and some don't think about it at all, or at least less than the average person.
Yeah, 100%. I think, I mean, I think about when I rent or buy a place, I am thinking about safety. So I am watching that. I never used to pay attention to the racial identities of people in my environment. But I do think about that now in terms of wanting to live in a more diverse, racially diverse area. Um, but I think the other piece I wanted to just throw in this climate where DEI is getting withdrawn, hacked apart, that sort of thing. I think it connects to what you're saying about place and space, because part of the reason or the point of DEI initiatives is to create, to remove that feeling of exclusion for people who have been historically marginalized and excluded from workspaces, right? So I can just roll into any place of employment. Caveat, if it's all male, that will feel a little different. But without those programs and policies, we are reverting these spaces to ones that are not welcome to folks who are different from white men, right? And so, but the white men aren't going to notice that, right? They're not going to roll into those office spaces and feel any different. But you rolling into one of those office spaces will probably feel a little different. Um, and like you've walked in somewhere and it doesn't quite feel right, and that is a unique experience, and I think that's particularly true for Black Americans in this country based on everything that you shared earlier in this phase. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think if we can just highlight this to make sure people stay vigilant in paying attention to where might you be safe, but not necessarily appropriate for the space, and how are you going to comport yourself accordingly? That's a
Mm-hmm.
big piece of it, right? All right, Lisa. Well, get us into phase two here.
All right, so it's kind of an extension, kind of. So
Mhm.
I had seen this piece about whether or not racial prejudice in the United States context is declining generationally. So grandparents to parents to grandkids, has the um, manifestation of racial prejudice decreased, and conversely, has the tolerance for discussions of race increased, right? Through generations. And I guess there was this book that came out a few years ago by Margaret Hageman, and it's called White Kids Growing Up with Privilege in a Racially Divided America. And it was 2 years of in-depth research where the author did all these interviews with white children and their families rather, to find out about how these white children learned about race, and how whether or not their family talked openly about race affected that child's kind of development or capacity to engage in discussions of racial privilege, and what that looks like. And so over time, generationally, those conversations about race have gotten more frequent in white families, although not frequent enough, right? And I just it feels what's the word I'm looking for? Like, this doesn't feel rocket science to me, that
Right,
when we're
right.
talking about just those three generations, grandparents, parents, kids, that the kids would be more able to engage in discussions of racial privilege, right? Like, that feels like that tracks for me.
Mm-hmm.
That might
Mm-hmm.
be regionally specific, but I would say, like, generally, that seems to make sense. But we now find ourselves in a situation where books about race and racism and the experiences of oppression and discussions in classrooms about
Yes.
whiteness and white privilege and white supremacy and kind of systemic racism are being
Mm-hmm.
ratcheted down to the point of
Mm-hmm.
meaninglessness, or they're just being erased completely, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
so any progress that has been achieved for white families generationally in terms of their capacity or ability to engage in discussions about race, it feels like we're doing a U-turn, a hard U-turn in
Mm-hmm.
2025. Like, it's been creeping
Mm-hmm.
along, right? But it feels like now we've got like a very clear and present 180-degree turn, where I feel like, what is that going to do? What is this climate going to do to young people as they kind of get older and become parents and grandparents? Like, how is that going to
Yes.
change?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and see, this is what's interesting to me is I feel like your U-turn analogy is perfect for this because it makes me think about, go with me, Lisa, help me to build the visual as I'm, trying to pull it together here. It's starting with the bad behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's let's mute, erase, delete, ignore the bad behavior by book banning, excluding that from formal education, etc. And then what happens, because I've also witnessed this too, white folks that carry privilege, folks that carry empowerment in this country are grown and they realize that they have been hoodwinked and bamboozled by not being formally educated or not knowing about certain concepts, book banning, etc. They get really pissed off, and then they start kind of the freedom school feel of, oh, now it's my job to make sure I educate my kids on this because I wasn't, or not. And then there's this ongoing cycle. So it kind of feels like a cycle where people
Mm.
just keep going without recalibrating, or hopefully they do recalibrate and get back into education. Because frankly, many of those folks have the most access to certain things, whether it's the most access to public libraries or the most access to money to buy the books that aren't being uh, taught in schools. That's what gets interesting to me, is that I feel like there could be a fork in the road and it's a choice for those family members to
Mm.
decide. But one fork in the road is, oh, well, they don't teach it at school, so I'm not going to go out of my way to teach it. Or I'm really pissed off that they're not teaching it in school and they're banning books, and so I'm going to go in the other direction. That to me feels like the white parent, grandparent, great great grandparent fork in the road. Um, I would say, based on my experience, that would be less of a fork in the road for Black people in particular, because we've always had to teach our own
Yeah,
history.
for sure.
So it's not
Mm-hmm.
like like, yeah, it pisses me off that books are banned, but it's not uncommon to our experience. So, given that freedom schools, our schools have always been freedom schools because we've always been teaching our communities what no one was willing to teach us. Not necessarily the case for white folks. And so, I was kind of floored when I was in a training. This was a few months ago. I was in a train. I think I shared this with you, Lisa, where there was a white woman in the training that said something to the effect of, and this was very crass, and people kind of laughed, but somewhat took it seriously. She said, well, eventually the bad guys have to die out at some point. And
Mm.
another white gentleman who's part of the LGBT community, because he mentioned that in some other conversation, he said, oh no, honey, what happens is the bad guys keep passing the information down.
Right.
And so, when I think about that, when I like, even, and I'm going to critique even my own community on this. I'm not saying that African-American communities go unscathed either. I have some really good friends who I consider pretty politically liberal who were, interestingly enough, not okay with book banning of African American history experiences, etc. But when it came to LGBT history
Mm-hmm.
education and experiences, they didn't want that in schools. And I said, again, my dialogue brain kicks in and says, okay, interesting. So if you don't want it taught in school, then are you willing to teach it at home? Because if you're
Yeah.
not willing to teach it at home or let your kids read it at home, then they'll never get it. So how exactly are they supposed to get it? And so in other words, what I'm saying, and this is not being an asshole, I'm just saying I'm grappling on how to raise my kids too. How do I raise my kids to not be assholes to other communities that they're not a part of if it's either not taught at school or not taught at home?
Yeah. Well, I
The
mean,
goal, the goal is to have them educated. And frankly,
mhm.
I would love for it to be both formal and informal. But if it's not formal, then where are they getting it from? And if you're not willing to teach it informally, then where is it coming from?
Well, my guess would be that they don't want it taught formally or informally, right? Like if they're okay with banning of a book of a particular that's talking about a particular injustice, they don't want their kids to be learning about it, which is a huge travesty, right? And a massive injustice to the kid. But um I do
Mm-hmm.
think, I mean, when you talk about race in the US context, right, families of color, Black families in particular, are talking about race all the time because it's so relevant to their lived experience, but white families are not doing that. So,
Ah,
so I think the likelihood,
yeah.
I mean, there are going to be white families who say exactly what you're saying. Okay, if it's not being taught in the schools anymore, I'm going to take that on because it's critical. But I worry and believe that there are probably more white families that might be like performatively that is not okay, and then they don't do anything in the
They don't do
home
the work. Yeah.
to then create that environment, which then perhaps sets in motion that cycle that you're saying, that then those children grow up, they feel like they have been like misled, right? They haven't been taught any information, and so then they start that
Mm-hmm.
cycle again. But I
Mm-hmm.
worry that whatever progress this author had identified in her book related to the increased capacity for conversations about race in a group of people who still, on the whole, find it very challenging to talk about race and racism. It's like the bury your head in the sand and it's not
Mm-hmm.
there kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Any
Mm-hmm.
excuse,
That's right.
any facilitator of the I don't have to talk about this is going to be grabbed, right?
Oh yeah.
Um,
Oh yeah.
so
Absolutely.
it just feels worrying. And this book was written in 2018. So they did
Mm,
2 years of research, right? And then it was published in 2018. So
right.
they probably were doing the research pre-Trump, right? That
Easily. Easily.
so it's curious to me then how significantly discussions of
Mm-hmm.
race among white people has likely changed from 2016 to now,
Oh
right?
goodness, yes. Oh yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we've talked about this before on the podcast around the uptick in the banned books in each state,
Yeah,
and the resistance too, as far as book sanctuaries and states
right.
that are pursuing that, a la Chicago public libraries. So, given that, I think it's always going to be interesting to see. Lisa, you're gonna laugh, but this is such a good analogy to it. So again, when I'm doom scrolling on social media, I was watching these school kids that were playing, they were doing tug of war. One side were the boys and the other side were the girls, and
Mm-hmm.
they organized by boy girl, but they also organized by just simply weight. So it may have been fewer boys and more girls, but regardless, the distinction was between the coordination. The boys weren't too coordinated, they were just kind of using their brute strength to try to win
Mm-hmm.
this tug of war. Whereas the the girls, and this was in another country, I believe they were in Thailand. The girls had a specific cadence to their pulls and to when they would
Okay.
exert energy and where they would not. I feel like the Chicagos and hopefully the Marylands and other places and spaces where they're trying to coordinate a lot of the book sanctuary experience systemically, I feel like they're the girls that are winning the tug of war. Like whoever can coordinate
Mm,
will be the people who eventually prevail. Whereas people popping all over the place and not really having a coordinated effort. Like I'm thinking about the wonderful folks that do homeschooling, they might do a really great job at this type of work or what have you. But if you're talking about the run of the mill person that's still trying to buy them expensive ass eggs and still go to work every day, are you really going to have time to teach on these topics?
right.
Even with your best hopes and efforts, there are so many hours in a day and you don't have them to teach these topics necessarily.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Nor are you equipped to teach them because unless you're a teacher, that's not really your job.
Right.
So, given that, I feel like the coordinated efforts, like those girls pulling the rope, the coordinated efforts are going to be the ones that do right by this topic in my estimation here. So if
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
book sanctuaries are doing more work, I know that most libraries do something very coordinated for drop-ins for homeschool kids to come in and learn about specific topics and so forth. I feel like some of those coordinated efforts will have the impact, but even the best intentioned folks, it's
Right.
gonna go back to your performative point there.
I mean, and in terms of coordination, the conservative right, has been coordinated for 60, 70 years in terms of the courts and in terms of getting to a point now where civil rights are suspect. DEI is suspect,
Oh, there
right?
you
So
go.
they have had a concerted, coordinated effort among many different
Yes.
people and professions and groups to get us to this point. And so, unless folks who feel differently respond in kind, then all that progress
Hmm.
that has been made in white families and in white spaces around discussions of race is going to just go poof, I think.
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. It's isn't it interesting how fragile
Yeah.
how
Yeah.
fragile these topics, like I feel similarly to, I
Mm-hmm.
remember when the first election when 45 won, I felt like I used this analogy, I believe on this podcast, where I talked about how it feels like President Obama took 8 years to close to perfectly decorate his home with the finest of china and everything down to the centimeter where he wanted to be. And then we got 45 that just took a bat and just ransacked this
Yep.
house that took 8 years in a few days. I feel similarly about topics like this, where
Yep.
people you may or may not be aware of who have worked for decades to make sure that people had access to this type of history, information, books, libraries. And with the stroke of a couple of pens, poof, like you
Yeah.
said, that's
Yeah.
what's very concerning to me, the fragility of all of this,
Mm-hmm.
all of this.
Mm-hmm.
So, uh, all right, Lisa. Well, look, I'm going to keep supporting our book sanctuaries until we figure this thing out.
Yes. 100%.
All right, so phase three. So, Lisa, over the last few weeks or so, we have been talking about a lot of things in regard to social media, media
Yep. Yep.
platforms, et cetera. And so this is a little bit of a different tweak on the same topic, but there was an essay that was published by Leah Asmelash, if I'm pronouncing the last name correctly. Forgive me if I'm not, on CNN.com, where there was a essay written entitled "What I Found When I Tried to Unplug from Social Media." Now, I pulled this because it was pretty interesting. Number one, because we've been talking about social media
Mm-hmm.
already on this
Mm-hmm.
podcast. But number two, for those of us who may be observant when it comes to the Christian tradition of fasting for Lent that's coming up in the future for 40 days from Ash Wednesday leading up to Easter or Resurrection Sunday, I'm thinking, oh, there's a lot of people that I know that kind of fast from social media. So let me read
Mm-hmm.
this to see what's different in their experience. And we already know, Lisa, we've talked about this, especially when it comes to youth, but I think just in general, regardless of age, the negative impacts of social media in general, when
Yep.
it comes to
Yep.
whether it's your self-esteem or whether it's comparing your day-to-day life to someone else's highlight reel, those types of things
Mm-hmm.
that happen with all of us. A friend of mine, he always says, he starts a story out about something on the news. He says, well, I was wasting my life on TikTok the other day. That's what he says, wasting my life on TikTok. Well, you do feel like sometimes, oh crap, I've been looking at this for like an hour and a half and didn't
Yeah.
realize I've been looking at this for
Yeah.
an hour and a half, right? And so, anyway, the author of the essay goes into talking about what occurred over the 3 days that they stepped away from social media. And it was this conundrum of trying to figure out if there is a balance and where is it in regard to maintaining one's social connections and relationships, but
Mm-hmm.
also not being so consumed with social media that it turns into brain rot, bed rot, what do they call it? Doom rolling, doom scrolling, all those different things that occur. And so it's kind of like, do you take the bad with the good? Do you take the good with the bad? Do you get rid of it
Mm-hmm.
entirely? I've even been reflecting, Lisa, on some of my friends who, frankly, never accepted social media. And I feel like it's kind of like that pair of jeans that was in style previously and then it wasn't for a while and now they're back in style. Like the people that were never on social media
Uh-huh.
are coming back in style now because there's such a conundrum
Yeah.
around it at all, much less which platform to go to. And so anyway, given all of that, I feel that tug in the experience. I've even had some more recent um, changes in my social media where Lisa, I am big on blocking folks, on unfollowing, on all those things, because I just feel like good fences make good neighbors type of thing when it comes to social media. Like, where are the boundaries with social media? Because
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to sacrifice my connections and real experiences. I mean, friends that I went to school with in kindergarten all the way up that I'm still connected to on social media. I don't want to give that up because of several bad
Yeah.
players or even bad
Yep.
content. I have not found the balance, let me be clear, but I know that there is usually this tug of war between, do I wash my hands of social media entirely because of those negative pieces, or do I navigate the negative in order to get to those positive things?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have an answer, Lisa, but what say ye in
Yeah.
regards to this unplugging that they're proposing here?
Yeah, and I think so this is less about kind of the politicization of social media and the decision making
Right.
of the leaders of the social media
Mm-hmm.
outlets, and more around how do you manage competing interests, I guess. And so one of the things that the author said was something to the effect of managing or redefining how you engage with social media. So instead of just scrolling for 90 minutes, that you're using it really intentionally. So if it is that childhood friend with whom you've lost contact or don't have a phone number that you want to reconnect with, and so you send them a message through Instagram or Facebook Messenger or something, or because you know that there's this group that has good recipes, and so you wanted creativity for your evening meal, and so you go on specifically to look for that recipe and get the thing that you want. And so that was a way that this author had talked about finding that balance, was that just redefining how they engaged with the social media space that I thought was interesting. um I mean, I came off of Facebook, right, which is but a while ago now, so it wasn't recently, but I remember I did it for more than 3 days, but I had to do, it was a
Yes,
process.
yes.
So
Mm-hmm.
I originally put the little time limit on the app on my phone. So it like blocked me after 20 minutes or 30 minutes. I forget what I did.
Oh, yeah,
But
yeah.
I over time reduced that time. Then
Uh-huh.
once I'd kind of gotten used to just being on there less, I deleted the app from my phone. that really
Uh-huh.
was that was really the change maker, because then I had to log in on a browser every time I wanted to go into Facebook, which added an extra
Oh.
level. And so I just didn't
Uh-huh.
do it. And then after about
Yeah.
2 or 3 weeks of that reduced access, I just stopped the urge, kind of like sugar. If you stop
Yes.
eating sugar for a
Yes.
week, then your urge to have it just goes away, right? It felt
Mm-hmm.
much like that for me. But of course, I'm still on Instagram, and you and I have talked about on previous podcasts, how do we balance
Yeah.
the business side of things? Never went on TikTok, so I
Yeah.
don't have to
Me
break
either.
away from
Yeah.
that. And I did
Mm-hmm.
have a Twitter account, but used it so infrequently that I have now deleted it. But
Yeah. Yeah.
so
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, I think this is just is social media is not going anywhere. It will
Mm-hmm.
evolve and develop into something you and I cannot think about, conceptualize now, right? Like,
Right, right, right,
because
right. Mm-hmm.
pre Facebook, you and I were like blissfully unaware of what social media could or would be, right? So I think
Uh-huh.
the same
Yeah.
is going to be true about its next evolution. So within that context, you know, maybe it isn't better to just erase it, because then you do lose connection. And how likely is it that Lisa's going to pick up the phone and call these folks? I mean,
Right. Right.
we've now all developed an aversion to phone calls, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I
You
don't
know,
Mm-mm.
how
Exactly.
how
That's
is
true.
that? That's not realistic. I think the author may have even talked about that, right? Like, am I really going to pick up
Yes.
the phone? And
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's
I
totally
was with
true.
her on that. I was like, absolutely not. Like if I have like a rotation of 5 people that I talk to on the phone, and other people know if and when they call me, they're probably calling me because it's an emergency. Otherwise, we're on social media or on a chat
Right.
somewhere. But, other than that, I'm like, why are you calling me? What are you doing? So, and I've even conditioned myself at this point to assume that if someone calls me, it's an emergency, because otherwise you would just text me or,
Mm-hmm.
send me a message on a social media platform. But, I thought it was so interesting. And I do think that everybody needs to figure out what's their what do people in the healthcare community call it? Their minimum effective dose. Is that what it's called? A
Mm,
minimal effective like what's enough for you? Like some people,
yeah.
hey, if you never get on it, never want it, I'm with you. If you have your minimum dosage, like I have a good friend of mine who travels the world for her job, she enjoys her family, enjoys, her husband and all that. And she only logs on one time a week on Saturdays. And that's when she does like her
Mm,
big update on this is all the stuff the family was doing, da 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 da. I was too busy enjoying it in the moment that I didn't
yeah.
stop and take time
Yeah.
to post that picture that I took. I'm just gonna do a photo dump once a week and there it is. People do it differently. And so I just felt it was interesting to think about. I have always found it interesting, Lisa, that you always have to consider the source too, in regards to what's too much and what's too little, because folks that aren't on social media at all will say posting once a day is like pulling teeth every day. Like it's a lot to them. Whereas people who
Yeah.
are frequently on social media posting once a day is like, oh, that's not too bad at all. That's not much at all. That's da da da. And so, just being careful as to what's your minimum effective dosage for you and your life. Even going back to what's the purpose of social media for you. Like there's some people that are, I just want to keep in touch with family and friends, and that's it. Or certain people that are like, nope, I use it strictly for business, or whatever those reasons
Yeah.
are, keeping those in focus. And I think from there you'll be fine. But yeah, I know that it's not going to be the same for everyone. And so I think sometimes we measure our social media experiences based on others when they may have different purposes in mind.
Yeah. I do wonder if there is some efficacy to coming off of social media for a period of time to test how you manage it. Like, are you on social media all the time because it's a reflex, it's a habit? Or are you
Yes.
actually on there because it is useful to your life? And if you go off of it for a week or two, I think you need to do it more than 3 days.
Yes, agreed.
Like, and
Mhm.
then notice, right? How is my life different, better, worse, the same? Did I lose touch with someone or not? Was I able to stay
Yes.
abreast of my favorite journalist or, news item? Did I still get that from other things? And if you're like 3 weeks and you're like, nothing has substantially changed, and I'm still in touch with the people I want to be in touch with, and I'm still getting the information that I want to get, then maybe you don't need to be stuck on your phone with social media, right? Like, I think that there's
Hmm.
also perhaps some benefit to trying that on for size. Um,
Yes.
so
Yes,
I
yes,
mean,
yes.
so there was this Doctor Who episode in the last season of Doctor Who. Shout out
Hmm.
to all the Whovians who are listening. But anyway, it's this other land or future place, and all of the people in the place have like a sphere that goes over their head. And so all they see in a day is people in little squares around them, like around their entire head. And that's how they
Oh,
walk.
okay.
And then they walk
Yes.
around because they get directions from the computer that does the sphere thing. Walk straight ahead, go to the left. Da, 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 da. So they never actually see the world, right? The show was actually about racism. It wasn't about that, but
Uh-huh.
I still think that that was a potential, like it was a good representation of how we are on social media, right? We're just
Hmm.
constantly looking at social media on our phones. We're only experiencing the
Hmm.
world through the intermedia app. We're not
Hmm.
actually experiencing the world by like being in it, you know?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. I mean, that's one thing that's recently gotten on my nerves about the boys when they will pull up YouTube to watch another kid play the same video game that they
Oh my
already
God, I've
have in the
totally heard of
house.
that. That just blows my mind. What are you doing?
But hold up. But then here's the infuriating part, Lisa. Going back to a previous phase where we talked about educating our kids at home, it doesn't dawn on them to use the very same YouTube to learn anything that they learned in school that day.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
So you'll watch YouTube to be entertained to watch a kid play a game, but it doesn't register to you that you have a paper that's due on the Civil War next week, and there's lots of really good information from PBS and elsewhere on YouTube that you could be watching to help you with your assignment.
Oh yeah. I mean, that makes more sense to me than the watching someone play a video game. I've never understood that. That's been
I don't
around for
get
a
it.
while and I've
I
never
don't get
understood
it.
it.
And
Yeah.
it would be different if like I understand that from many, many moons ago playing video games where it would be useful to watch a snippet of a video game to figure out how to unlock the next level because you've been
Yes.
struggling with a week or something like that. But when you're just I don't have the game on, I don't have anything else going on. I just got my bowl with my popcorn watching another. I'm like, no way, no way. I refuse to let this level of nonchalant disengagement to exist in my house. No.
Yeah.
And so
Done.
things
Yeah.
like that. But that to me constitutes brain rot. Like that's one of the best examples of it. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, but I do feel like you're right. There's something that needs to happen in regards to making sure that we aren't functioning in that way. Um, because it does, well, I think two things are compounding of the level of usage of social media, but then also the compounding of all of us emerging from a pandemic where we had to be
Yeah.
functioning in that way. And now that we no longer need to be, it's like, okay, we are producing people of all ages that don't know how to engage with other human beings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And partially it's because some of it was mandated that you couldn't, but now that we can, are you? Eh. So yeah, but I do think if there's, I mean, I know that addiction, social media addiction is very real. So I do want to take seriously your point around how do you respond even biologically? Like, are your hands sweating or, is your
Mm-hmm.
heart rate going up because you haven't looked at it in over an hour? Pay attention to those things, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I thought that there were some good lessons to be learned from unplugging. So for folks that may want to consider stepping away, or I know for me, stepping away from time to time really helps. So you're not looking at other people's highlight reels. You're not, getting engaged with other folks' lives that may not make you feel too great. All those mental health things that connect with it. But yeah, more than 3 days would be desirable. All right. Well, that's a wrap, Lisa, for this week's episode. So in the meantime and in between time, let me tell folks how you can stay connected with us. Of course, you may be even watching this on YouTube, and make sure that you subscribe and follow us there. Apple Podcasts and Spotify, you can also find us there. Instagram, every week we announce our episode of the week, so please stay in touch there. Our new podcasts always drop on Tuesdays, and ever so often, Dr. Lisa and I have a lot to say, so there might be a bonus something ever so often. LinkedIn at Unfazed Pod, and of course, you can email info@unfazedpodcast.com. And if you forget all of that, don't worry. You can go to our website that has all the things, unfazedpodcast.com, where you can find both our new and old shows. So if you like this week's episode, please subscribe, leave a review, share with your friends, coworkers, or anyone else in this phase of your life. So, Dr. Lisa, until next time.
See you next time.